member of the board of Marin CNPS and member of the board of the College of Marin.
Yeah. Okay. Naftali Moed.
Yeah, Naftali Moed, California State Parks Natural Resource Program.
Thank you. Mike. Okay.
Hi there, Mike Swayze. I'm Vegetation Program Manager with Novato Fire. Also helped with the ESP thing, and I'm on the board of Marin Conservation League.
Okay. And this California Native Plant Society, there's no name. I don't know who that is.
That's Dave Long. He already introduced himself.
Oh, okay. Hi, Laura. Laura.
Yeah, Laura Lovett, board member, California Native Plant Society, Friends of Corte Madera Creek Watershed.
Okay. Sherry. Sherry Adams. Okay.
She already introduced herself.
You got me.
I think
Okay.
we have everyone, Bill.
Do we? Bill Carney's here. I let him in, so I think we're.
Yeah. Hi, Bill Carney, Sustainable San Rafael, and Marin Can.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Okay, everybody, we're here. You know who we are, and we can get started with the program for today. And
Hey, Val, there's some community members.
are there?
Yeah,
Okay. I don't know how to deal with that. How do I vote? If you are a community member, you might want to introduce yourself. Hello.
Hello, Stephen Keys. I'm a citizen advocate on wildfire.
Oh, okay. Anybody else?
Caroline Martirano, Restoration Coordinator for CMPS.
Good. Anyone else? Thank you. Okay, well, we have a wonderfully mixed, excellent group today. And so the first thing that we're going to do with this, we're going to do a few ESP administrative matters. And the first thing is to mention to you all the status of the ESP guidelines, which have been under review now for a year. And I think we have some good news about the status of the review. So Anne, would you want to say a word about that? And then I can say anything if I want, okay?
Yes, you can say whatever you'd like, Bill. Yeah, so as many of you are aware, members of the ESP provided guidance to the MWPA in terms of ecologically sound practices for vegetation management, carbon management, defensible space work. And so we went through our process of reviewing with council, with our environmental consultants, working with ESP again to draft some edits, and then bringing that to our committee. So the advisory technical committee reviewed that document, provided a lot of feedback. We went back and forth several times on that process, and then went to the operations committee. So the advisory technical committee decided to approve the document as it was drafted, and moved on up to the operations committee, which also took a vote and approved that to move that along to the board. So the board will consider the ESP document probably in June. The May agenda is just too packed because we are working on our annual work plan update. So that's in progress, but we should be able to see the ESP document at the board level in June. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Anne, and thanks for all that you've done on this. And we're, those of us who have been working on this, feeling, all of us here on ESP are really thrilled that we've made it this far. And we're looking forward to June when we can make a presentation and look forward to talking about it further. Okay.
Thanks, Val.
Yeah. Mark, have you got anything that you want the group to know that's happening with MWPA that they might otherwise not know about?
I think I just connect with what Ann said, and that's our main effort right now is the approval of our work plan that has $19 million worth of different wildfire mitigations projects and prevention projects, ranging from these space inspections to vegetation management projects to evacuation system improvements and everything in between. And then with the work plan comes our budget approval, and by our ordinance, it has to be done by May 31st. And so that's why we're pushing so hard to get it done this month. And then that'll allow us to have June for the ESP document to be more of a focus rather than an afterthought during the meeting.
Okay, thanks. I think those are the announcements. Anybody else has anything they want to ask about or comment on? Otherwise, we can go to the main event. And I'm not sure that we have a meeting scheduled for June 7th, but we're thinking of replacing the meeting with a field trip. And I sent out an outline of what that field trip would be. And Maria, did you want to say a word about that?
Yeah, so it's definitely still in the planning phases right now. We're working on selecting a couple vegetation management sites to take you guys out to in Central Marin. But right now we're looking at June 7th, like Belle said. And the time is really up to you all and what works for you, morning, afternoon. Yeah, you guys can decide on that.
Yeah, so we're really looking forward to that. So we'll get back to that later. And you can let us know what works better, whether it's morning or afternoon for a field trip. So let's get now to the main purpose of the meeting, which is a presentation by through MWPA on the science behind fire fuel reduction. And they have a very good webinar panel. And I'll hand it over to Bruce.
And Maria, are you going to put up the screen?
Yeah, can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Yes. Let's see, that's not my PowerPoint.
Yeah, this one's just the title slide. Like Belle said, we're talking about the science behind vegetation management today.
Okay.
And we have 3 speakers that will go after. Bruce gives us an introduction. The first one is Michael Jones from UC ANR. The second is Paul Lowenthal from Santa Rosa Fire Department. And the final one is Carl Sanders from MMWD. And then this is just a broad overview of the topics that we're going to be going over. And we'll refresh you on the questions before each section, but I will hand it over to Bruce first.
So Marie, do you have my PowerPoint to present here?
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Okay, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks. We've put this all together with best intentions. So my job as president here last couple of years is really to help make sure that things are working properly and we're doing things in a responsible manner. Really committed to the ESP work that we're doing, and in essence that we made a commitment to all the work that we're going to do here in Marin will abide by some strategic plans that we have in place and also adhere to the best available science. So I'm going to start out by what are the key drivers behind our work? And they're listed here. We're lucky to have a state-of-the-art 2020 Marin County CWPP, which I'll just show very briefly. Secondly, over the last 2 years, the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority team, the directors and leadership developed a strategic plan, and we have a plan of work. We have 5 specific objectives that we're trying to achieve, and that is what helps us. This is what drives our program. We're not straying from strategic objectives that we have here. The point is that, and Chief Executive Officer Mark Brown and team and Ann, and I think all of the people involved would agree that we are taking a systems approach, a systematic approach towards hazard mitigation, and in essence, following the best guidance and available science. Next slide, please. I want to start with this. Everybody knows what this is, but I think this is where we all have to start when we talk about what we're doing and why. This is the data. This is the raw data that we use as a starting point to identify where we need to take action, where we need to mitigate hazards. And the data, I'll just state it, and I think you're all here and you understand that the data is very clear that our communities are really very much at risk of catastrophic fire. I think we all know where we are in this map. So let's go to the next slide, please. There's one more slide. Is there a slide of the?
Am I missing one?
I'm looking for the wildfire history map. Okay, well, let's just stop here for a second then. I intended to show an image which is which several of you have previously seen, which is a map of the history of wildfire in Marin County. And that image is available online. It's available in several places. But the point of the image is to know that we've had extensive fire here in Marin County, and I think the record is incomplete. And we've come to know firemen, fire scientists, firefighters have come to know that that fires repeat themselves, and it's a result of where are the likely ignition sources, where are the hazardous fuel conditions, what are the prevailing weather patterns. And what I wanted to make the point of is on the map, had I had it, is that in 1929, at the intersection of Highway 101 and 37, a farmer was plowing his fields and he ignited a fire. And it was a northeastern wind. It was fall. I think it was late October, early November. I could be corrected. But that fire burned from Highway 101, 37 all the way out to the coast to Stinson Beach. And that footprint today, that vegetation is just alive and ready. It's decadent, dense, and ready for another fire. And it could happen again. So, in essence, we know fire history. We know that we can take intervene. And now's the time for us to really think strategically and to modify the fuel profiles where we can to moderate the next fire's behavior. And not just moderate the behavior, but really to improve our ability to suppress the fire and stop the advance of fire. So next slide, please. This I think you're all aware of this, but there are two documents that drive MWPA's projects and program of work. And the first is this recent document. It's the Marin Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And I suspect that most of you have seen it, but there are a couple of unique attributes about this plan. As it says here, it provides a framework for our annual work plans and investments. But I think what is unique about this plan, it was a little bit risky, is the center image here. This is a parcel map. And we took the time, Marin County staff, they took the time to do an analysis of the structure of the vegetation and the surrounding vegetation, and to assess the fire risk for every single parcel and every single home in Marin County. So you see the darker, moderate, and lighter indicate, in essence, risk. It helps us think strategically as far as where do we need to start with our vegetation management work. So this, besides the parcel level assessment, this plan identifies the critical hazards in, around, and there were 300 projects identified in the appendix that serve as the backbone for the work that is being done now in Marin County. So next, please.
Bruce, what year was that?
2020, I believe, was the, I see Mark Brown. Mark was the deputy chief at that time, and he should know. Thanks, Mark, for your nod. The second driving document is that over the last year and a half, as I said, MWPA, key directors and staff, we took time to sit down and develop a strategic plan. And for those of you familiar with strategic plans, this is serious business. It's not just mission, it's not just vision, and it's not just your mission and what you're going to do to achieve your vision. But there were specific goals here, and these are the 5 goals. There are objectives associated with those goals, and then there are metrics associated with each one of those those goals. And so here, very quickly, on the left-hand side, public education, inform the public so that they can make intelligent, informed decisions. Secondly, we said, we have to reduce risk to home. And so we have, as I think most of you know, defensible space evaluations. As it states here, about 1/3 of all the residents in Marin County are being inspected annually. And they're getting a prescription that provides them with what it is they need to do to protect their property. And we're taking a house out, home hardening approach, providing them with a written prescription. And so every homeowner is informed and ability to make a good decision that's going to make themselves safer. The third goal is evacuation system improvements. And I think you all understand the importance of that. If we have a fire, we got to get out, and the firefighters need to be able to get in. So there's a big investment in evacuation work. The fourth one is grants to residents. There's a suite of grants programs, but bottom line is to help those that need help in getting their work done. And then the fifth, and I think this, when we start talking about wildland fuels, vegetation management, local wildfire prevention, this I think is where we're going to get. There's science in public education. There's science in home hardening. There's good science base behind evacuation. But I think the science
without discerning it.
Excuse me, would you please silence? Cell phone, would you please silence yourself? 415-686-3660. We'll talk about the science and the fifth goal, and that's what this program is trying. So let's go to the next guiding factor, please. Next slide. Belle,
Yeah.
Here we are. This is the product. This is the work that was done over the last 2 years.
Yeah.
This is a driver, and we spent almost 2 years over I'd say 50 to 60 environmentalists and operational fire staff worked to develop this set of environmentally sound practice. It is in essence, it's in print. It's for you to review as Ann described. It's going to go before the board for approval, but we excerpted some of the best available science that we could find in regards to what are the principles around vegetation management to reduce fuel hazard. What are the principles around defensible space to improve around your home, but leave it in an environmentally healthy and responsible way. And thirdly, what are we going to do with all this biomass, and how are we going to manage it? What do we convert it to into a carbon responsible end product? So next slide, and this I'll go very quick here. I'm nearly done. I just want to show that the first objective, public education. Top left is we have webinars. Top right is workshops. Bottom right corner is there's a whole series of 2 to 5 minute videos that Mark, Executive Officer Brown, and others have produced. And then finally, the bottom left is public education. We're knocking on doors and we're leaving a prescription with every single landowner, homeowner to say, this is what you have, this is what you need to do to make yourself safe. Next one, please. House Out. House Out is scientifically based. It's relatively new. I've been at it for 50 years. We didn't think about this in 73. But I can tell you that the science has shown, know your parcel, know the risks around you. Secondly, if you don't harden your home, if you don't have the right vents, the right siding, a 0 to 5 zone, that your home is going to likely catch on fire due to ember storms. And third, of course, is the defensible space work. So House Out is scientifically based. Let's move to the next one, please. Big deal, big investment, over $1 million in assessing the routes and the constriction points and problems that we may have here in Marin, and to allow us to be able to address them. There are going to be 2 components to this. One is, what do you do with the hardscape? What do you do with the roads, the width, the stop signs, the lights, et cetera, et cetera. But critically then, if cars are stopped on a roadway, as they may be here, if there's a fire, what modifications to vegetation may be necessary to increase the margin of safety for those residents trapped in their vehicles. You'll see more of that here in the next 1.5 years. And I look forward, Mark and team, to getting this together and also to bring this out to you, to the public, to understand what we're doing and why. It's not just an assessment, but this is going to end up developing a substantial amount of our upcoming program of work. Next, please. Clearing, this is it. This is a real deal. This is a fire engine before. This is the same route after. I think it's real clear that the work that is done makes this route much more safe in the event of wildfire, both for be able to defend something and be able to get in and out safely. Next, please. And we're getting into shaded fuel breaks. This is new. We're starting. We are this last year and coming into this year, our members are advancing projects that are shaded fuel breaks, and they're strategically placed. They're designed based on current best available ability to model fire, to simulate modification of the vegetation profile, and to get the kind of fire that you would prefer to get if you're a firefighter and you want to stop a fire. So this really, I think, is next slide. Let's skip this, but basically, it's clear how we're going to spend our funds: vegetation management, defensible space, and community projects. And then, lastly, please. So this is what our program is going to be. And Matt, I think that Maria, you may want to. Do you want to take this from here?
Yeah, that works. So from here, we're going to start our first segment, which is going to be led by Michael Jones, and we're actually going to switch screen sharing for this one. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Question is he here?
Yeah, he's here. He just shared his screen.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, all right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for having me. My name is Michael Jones. I am the University of California Cooperative Extension Forest Advisor for Mendocino Lake and Sonoma counties. And I'll be talking about how we think about vegetation management, why we want to continue to have this conversation and implement vegetation management as it relates to in context with wildfire and community safety and forest health. I also just want to say that I don't operate in Marin too often, but just listening to what you all have been talking about now and my previous conversations with the group, that's a really an impressive thing that you have accomplished, and it's great to see, and a model that I would love to see replicated in other areas who are dealing with the same questions and same issues you are. So kudos for y'all for making this work and having a really productive and forward-moving conversation on these really important topics. All right. So vegetation management in how we in relation to the wildfire, and this is specifically we're talking about forest lands, right? We're not going to be really going into the other habitat types in California. So the way that I'm going to kind of frame this is I'm going to throw a bunch of information at you very quickly, and it's going to be overwhelming, and I'm sorry for that, but this is a science. This is a process that we've been studying for a very long time. And so I think there's some things that we need to kind of to contextualize the conversation and kind of introduce the ideas of why we talk about the things I am. We have to set up the kind of idea of what California ecology and the vegetation ecology, which I'm sure you all are very familiar with, so this might be preaching to the choir. And then, how we think about, improving forest health and wildfire and resiliency to disturbances, in particular wildfire, and how we achieve that through active stewardship or vegetation management, or fuels, if you want to specifically refer to the vegetation for wildfire risk. So this is, this is pretty standard info, but I think this is really important to always reiterate. We really need to remember that we are in a fire adapted ecosystem, right? I'm sure y'all, the CNPS folks and everyone here, we know that the vast majority of vegetation that occurs natively in California is fire adapted to some extent. We have stratinous species. We have a significant portion of the vegetation that requires fire in some part of its life cycle. And that's because we live in a Mediterranean climate where fire is a very common occurrence during the dry summer months. Through natural ignitions, we had a very regular fire return interval. So we had frequent fires very frequently. And with Native American or Native Californian burning, it was actually much more common, right? And so we know from research coming out of Scott Stevens' lab at Berkeley that we have a variety of fire return intervals, or the periods between natural ignitions and Native Californian burning. And just to highlight this very small, hard to read graph, two habitat types that maybe we're most interested given where we are the redwoods and oak woodlands. And we see that fire return intervals through human management are anywhere from 3 to 30 years. So on average, we're looking at a very, very frequent fire return interval across the landscape part of the world. So fire is absolutely crucial to the way our habitats look right now, right? They are what has shaped the flora and fauna. They have adapted to living in a fire ecosystem. And with that additional introduction of fire through human management, it has undoubtedly shaped the way the forests look today. And on top of that, it's a common disturbance, meaning that it's a really important part of a dynamic forest ecosystem, and it serves the similar role as forest pests like bark beetles and diseases and wind events or drought. These are all important disturbances that shape the ecology of our landscapes. Yeah, Bruce, did you have a question?
Michael, you were getting some delay in your vocal, so perhaps maybe if you could turn off your video, maybe you're with a little bit. Thank you very much. Yeah, we want to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thanks, Jim Cash.
Yeah, let me know if it's still lagging. I'll try to log back in with my phone. But yeah, let me know, please. Thank you for that. All right, so we are in a fire adapted ecosystem. Fire is an important disturbance. It shaped the flora and fauna, and a really crucial part of our ecosystem. So what's perhaps the largest impact to, we could probably have this conversation all day about historical land management practices, changes in land management. God knows, we could probably create a long list, but the really important one we're going to focus on right now is fire suppression, the removal of fire from a fire adapted ecosystem. And this is a rather famous photo. This is Bear Creek Guard Station in the Plumas National Forest. We have a time series. We have 1910, so right about the time of the creation of the Forest Service. Undoubtedly, there was logging practices going on there, but you see there's a lot of big trees spaced out. And then we go to, what is that, almost 100 years later, and we see that we have this very different distribution of biomass. Maybe it wasn't that there's more biomass, but we've shifted from few big trees to a lot of small trees on the landscape. And that undoubtedly is a factor of fire suppression and land use practices. So that is the Sierra, but here's a more local example. So this is just from a project I was looking at land use change and changes in vegetation distribution. This is, again, aerial photography up in Mendocino County. We just have a ridgeline. This is a Cow Mountain area kind of in Anderson Valley, Boonville. And we see that from 1952 to 2021, we have a pretty significant increase in biomass within these oak range, these kind of rangeland oak woodlands. And this is, again, a factor of exclusion of fire from the landscape. And so there's no doubt that has been a huge factor in that has created kind of these conditions that we're experiencing right now, is that we removed a really important disturbance that maintain the health and the resiliency disturbance of our forest ecosystems. And so this is a really important thing that we have to think about, is that now there's an abundance of biomass, or we've transitioned or shifted that distribution of biomass from few big trees in the landscape to lots of small trees densely packed together, right? And so that really impacts the resiliency of these ecosystems or these habitat types to wildfire, right? When you have this dense distribution of lots of small trees, and we all think about how big trees have these morphological characteristics that help make them more resilient or tolerant of fire damage, whereas small trees and even our different species have different fire tolerance strategies, or they can be adapting to fire through embracing fire or tolerating fire damage. But when we change the distribution of species, not only by size class, but by the actual species themselves, we influence the ability that system to be resilient to disturbance, but in particular wildfire, right? So here we have oak woodlands that are being encroached with conifers and other hardwoods. It's also a significant impact on forest health, right? So if we have an absence of a disturbance, what we get is a natural process of succession in a forest ecosystem, right? So in the big picture on the right, this is black oak forest, or black oak woodlands, and what we have is Doug fir encroachment. Now, without fire, this is a natural process of succession. This is absolutely the way the forest succeeds. Conifers come in under the hardwoods, and then a lot of our habitats would probably transition to more conifer dominated or conifer mixed hardwood dominated. This isn't a bad thing. This is just a factor of no disturbance. But when you're in a fire adapted ecosystem, that can be a pretty big deal. And I also want to point out the reason why we have as much oak woodland habitat as we do these days is because of native California burning, right? It's very evident that in the 100 years of fire suppression, we can see how quickly the conifers encroached into these oak woodlands. But this is pretty important. If your whole goal and objective of management is to conserve or improve the health or expand oak woodlands, if you have lots of conifers growing there, that's going to certainly change the health of those systems and just introduce a lot of competition and change the way those stands respond to wildfire. But associated with this idea is not just the encroachment of different types of species, but now we have a whole suite of native forest pests and diseases that their whole purpose and existence is to help cull dead and dying trees from the landscape. That's a really important part of the forest, the dynamic forest ecosystem, is that we need biotic disturbances that help to recycle nutrients, that help to change the forest structure and composition, that serve as food for wildlife, create habitat for wildlife. These kinds of forest insects are really important for the ecosystem. But when we disrupt the natural, ecological processes, and primarily through, as I keep reiterating, removal of disturbances like wildfire, we create unhealthy forest conditions where we ultimately lead to result in kind of landscape scale outbreaks of insects that can do pretty extensive damage. So we have forest health problems with our oaks. And these are native. This is Western oak bark beetle that's really kind of flaring up because they like drought stressed trees. In the bottom picture, this is a more recent photo from the Lake County Napa area. And if y'all have kind of been, as you drive around looking around, we are currently at what is the incipient stage of a bark beetle outbreak. And so for the North Coast region, so we're experiencing rather significant and substantial conifer mortality across the landscape. And it's unfortunately only going to get a lot worse before it stops. And that presents a lot of issues. That's a huge forest health concern. And because a lot of these are showing up in communities, it now becomes a community safety and wildfire risk factor. And so this is all kind of, these issues are things that we can actively manage through good stewardship. I know for y'all and on the coast, we're really concerned about sun of death. And right, so this is an invasive organism. So it has a very much different ecology than a native bark beetle or native disease would have. But how we manage it or how we think about it is the same idea. Now we're adding a lot of dead and declining trees to the landscape. And we have to figure out what to do with that dead fuel and how that affects the ecosystem and the ecology of these habitats, and how we manage for that long-term, short-term, how they deal with that with the fire. And what do we do about, kind of trying to protect, if that's even a possibility, or conserve these habitats when dealing with these kinds of disturbances that are not native, and how does that impact, native processes or fire regimes? It's going to be pretty significant. So that's kind of this idea that we have this accumulation of biomass or redistribution of biomass. So how does that affect fire behavior? This is a pretty typical kind of process that we think about. We have surface fuels, which are kind of the stuff that occurs on the ground. We have ladder fuels, or those intermediate fuels that kind of connect the surface fuels to the canopy or the crowns, and then we have our crowns. And when we have this, accumulation of biomass or redistribution of biomass, we have continuity of fuel sources, and so we can have more significant fire behavior that results in what we call stand replacement or canopy replacement fire, and you can have pretty significant ecological impacts from these kinds of fires. And we've certainly seen that in the Sierra for a long time, but they're starting to occur on the coast. So this is from the El Niño fires. The one on the left is the Wallbridge fire. So that was kind of the west of Healdsburg. And the other one is the Myers Grade fire, which was literally right on the coast. And this is something that I really think I would ever expect to see. But this is what I would call stand replacement fire in redwood forests. And so it's not true stand replacement fire because redwoods are kind of these crazy weed alien trees that will resprout for the most part, but a lot of them, these trees did die. But this is, you know, you have complete, what do we want to say here? Complete consumption or removal of the overstory canopy from these forest structures. And so that's a very significant ecological impact that we have yet to really understand long-term what that means. And certainly something that we're also kind of grappling with in down in Santa Cruz with the CZU fire. But in these systems, these even big trees were getting completely torched out and having canopy loss and potentially dying. So these are pretty significant impacts that, you know, I think we could all agree that historically probably was not, you know, a very common occurrence. So what can we do in this process, right? We know there's a lot of conversation about this, that we have the kind of the fire behavior triangle where we have the three pillars of fuels, topography, and weather. And we know topography we can't do anything about unless we decided we wanted to bulldoze every ridge across the landscape, which I don't think any of us want to do. We arguably for this talk, we can't control weather. We can certainly think about climate change and what that means, and certainly how that's influencing fire behavior, right? Of the 20 last California wildfires, over half of them have occurred in the last 5 years or so. So that's, I mean, it's hard to argue against what's happening right now with wildfire behavior. And so the last part that we can really manage is fuels and the vegetation. So thinking about how the vegetation in these ecosystems is distributed and how we can act through active stewardship, change that to create more healthy and more resilient to disturbance forest structure. So here's some examples I'm going to go through. This is from the goat fire, I believe. Yes, the goat fire in 2000. This was in Lassen. So this is a Sierra example, but what we have here is the fire, and in the little orange circle in the middle, that was an area it's a high use area. I think it was a campground that they had thinned for fuels reduction and forest health, right? So thinning also helps control or mitigate the impacts of bark beetles. And what we see is we have a lot of stand replacement fire, but the green inside this little island is where there was active management. So that's an example from the Sierra. This is an example of the Negron fire. This is Humboldt County. So this is still on the eastern side of Humboldt County, but I think this is even kind of more robust example where you have a thin treated stand where you know, you had active management with an untreated stand, and you see a clear delineation where fire behavior was substantially different between the two structures in the forest. And then more recently, example from the Sierra, we have the Caldor fire, and by all research and folks, firefighters on the ground and forest managers, there's a lot of strong evidence to suggest that active stewardship of these forests played a huge part in changing fire behavior, or giving firefighters the opportunity to do direct or indirect fire operations to protect communities. And so I think that this is, you know, really, as the research and the information continues to come out of this fire, I think it'll be really important to show how different types of treatments and how different types of not just the kind of treatment, but when it was implemented and what kind of combinations of treatments and the kind of maintenance that was conducted in those treatments influences our ability to either change fire behavior for community protection, or to look at the ecological impacts of these kind of really significant extreme fire behavior events. So what is thinning? We're not framing thinning around the idea of commercial harvesting. This is really about changing or modifying the structure of the vegetation. So removing those ladder fuels to break up the continuity of the fuel structure from the surface to the canopy, increasing spacing between trees, both vertically and horizontally. And then like I mentioned, the whole point of that is to reduce fuel continuity, right? It's not that we're keeping fire out of these systems. It's not that we're making them impervious to fire. It's that we're making it so when they do burn, because they will burn, that the fire behavior is such that it's less severe. And if there is a need for direct fire suppression, there's that opportunity to interact with that fire. And ultimately, the way we're thinking about this is we want fewer trees in landscape, but we want them to be bigger, right? So we're distributing that that biomass back into fewer, more dispersed or spread out big trees across the landscape. So here's kind of how that looks in implementation. Removed a lot of the understory, not all of it, right? Because that is the regeneration. We need to save some of the small trees because they are what replaces the big trees as they die. But we're removing a lot of it. And so we're opening up and spacing those trees out. And that's kind of the principle here. Now the fire comes through. We see that, we keep the fire on the surface fuel. The idea and the intent is not, we want heterogeneity in the way wildfires burn. There's no argument from me or from the science about that. We want diverse burn infrastructure, right? We want high severity fire to occur in some areas. We want low severity fire to occur in a lot of other areas, or moderate fire severity, because that creates complexity and heterogeneity in the forest structure and the composition of those species that occur in the forest and habitat. But the idea is that we're trying to reduce the scale of which we're getting high severity wildfire and changing the fire behavior in a way such that we're not that's not resulting in these hundreds of thousands of acres or hectares of stand replacement wildfire, which is an ecological, a very high ecological severity impact, and is a pretty hard thing for these systems to recover from. So why do we do thinning? I've been talking about the principles of it. Here's some of the implementation, what we've been doing on the coast, and my colleagues have been working on. Right, so we're thinning from a fuels reduction perspective. Very much what we're thinking about in near communities and within wildland urban space. We're removing thin, small, suppressed and weak trees to open up the story, change that distribution of biomass, and to make the trees that are left in the area more resilient to disturbance. We reduce that competition so that we free them up to grow bigger and to be vigorous and healthy and more resilient to not just fire, but other types of disturbance. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because Chief Lowenthal definitely the expert on this subject, but it's just really important to reiterate and we probably will reiterate again and again that shaded field breaks are not implemented to stop fire. That is not their function. There's a paper that came out a few years ago that said if you wanted a shaded field break that by itself was able to stop fire, it had to be over a 1/4 mile wide. And that's not what shaded field breaks goals or the function of shaded field breaks is. It's a strategic thinning, usually in conjunction with some kind of access point. And what it does is it's meant to change fire behavior, right? To drop in this photo you see here. You want to drop the fire out of the canopy. Maybe it becomes a surface fire or lowers in intensity. And it provides an opportunity for direct suppression activity. Or if it's combined with other types of forest management practices, you can modify the fire behavior for long enough that you can either have weather conditions, or you can have other suppression activities that help manage or change that fire. And maybe it becomes a burn that you can continue to let burn, or you can successfully suppress that fire. But they are not intended to stop fire. That is not their role. It's to change fire behavior, right? So that we can strategically respond to that particular fire. I talked about this a little bit. We're thinning for oak woodland health, right? We're removing that encroachment of Doug fir or other types of hardwoods or other types of conifers to release our oaks and to reduce fuel loading so that they are more resilient to fire. My colleagues have been working on this a lot, and they have found that when you thin out Doug fir from around mature oaks, that you do see a positive response from the oaks. They actually do put on more growth and they do respond, become more vigorous. So there is certainly value in thinning out around our oaks and reducing that density around our high value oak trees and thinning out our oak woodlands. And we're also managing forest health. I've been talking a lot about that, but it's the same principles, reducing that fuel loading. The whole point is to change fire behavior so the forest can more readily respond to that fire behavior through their fire adapted strategies. We're improving vigor by reducing that competition so the trees can grow bigger and they can be more resilient to insects and diseases. And in these two examples on the bottom left, we have, this is a, it's in this year, I just lost the name. It's the giant sequoia. It's old growth giant sequoia. And on the right, we have old growth redwood. In both of these systems, the intent is to thin the understory and open up some of the canopy to facilitate fast growth and to grow these big old growth like characteristic trees to create a more resilient structure. And you can think of all the other things you might want big trees in the landscape, like carbon sequestration or just having old growth characteristics in the associated habitat. So there is a role in thinking about strategic thinning as a way of improving forest health and the resiliency of these forest systems. So what are the tools we use for management, right? And this is not, I'm not suggesting that these are all things that y'all are gonna have to do, but these are the ways that we are currently thinking about how we conduct and how we are actively implementing this fuels reduction or the thinning or the forest health work. So the very obvious one is hand thinning, just workers with chainsaws cutting and pulling vegetation out of the forest or leaving it there. We have mastication. We see more and more opportunities for mastication. It's a pretty impressive kind of practice that certainly has application for some particular habitats and for some particular reasons, but it will not always be the best option, but it certainly has application as a very impressive tool. We do have commercial thinning, and I'm not suggesting this is something that you have to pursue. But I will say that if you when I talk to private landowners, if you're a small landowner and you're struggling with the daunting task of managing your forest lands, stewarding your forest lands, and you realize the cost of doing this work, if you could selectively thin some of the bigger trees out, not the biggest, we're not taking the biggest, but we're taking some of the bigger merchantable trees, and you're taking a couple of those out, and you're creating the opportunity to then get in-kind service or financial return that helps you establish and continue further vegetation management and maintenance, I think that's a really valuable tool for the sustainability of managing and creating healthy and sustainable forest structure. So it is an option. It doesn't mean it's always the right option, but it certainly does have applications. And then grazing. This is fun. Everybody loves grazing. Goats are awesome, sheep are awesome. It's very fun to put them in a forest and see what they do. If you are trying to regenerate trees, you do not want to use goats right away. They will eat everything. So think about that if you're strategically thinking about regeneration and when and how you use these different systems. When, this is probably the most important part. And this is something that I'm actively doing research on and we're investigating more and more is, you create all this biomass and we call it slash, so this vegetative waste. And now under forest practice rules, you have to manage it. But as small landowners or as you're doing field reduction projects, you have to think about what you're going to do with this material. So you can either pile and burn it, right? So you pile it up in the forest, recut it, and burn it when it's a good burn window. You can chip and mulch it, which is pretty cool. But again, it's just like mastication. It's not always feasible. It can be pretty expensive. You can remove it, like this bottom right photo. I think that's a level of sanitation that I'm not ready to pursue. But boy, it looks like a park. I mean, they did a really nice job. I can't imagine how much that costs, but that's certainly an option too. You can pull it all out. And then lastly, you can lop and scatter. And that's pretty much a traditional practice where the idea is you cut the vegetation, you then cut it into small pieces and spread it down below a certain height across the forest floor. Now, the problem with lop and scatter, and I'll talk about where I'm going with this in a second, is that the assumption was that you cut it into small pieces, it's not susceptible to insects, which is typically true. And then because you've compacted it and made it in contact with the forest floor, it will then decay fairly quickly and you remove that biomass. What we're finding though right now is with climate change and some of these other impacts of historical forest management and our forest ecosystems is it's not doing what it's supposed to. So if you're going to lop and scatter, I think that's still a reasonable option, but I think it needs to be combined with prescribed fire. And so this is probably the most important tool that I think we have, is that we're in a fire adapted ecosystem. We've removed fire from the landscape for the most part for the last 100 years. And this is a way that we bring it back in. All right, so the idea of prescribed fire is the use of fire, we call it good fire, under predetermined conditions to achieve very specific goals and objectives. That can be for wildfire fuels reduction, for ecosystem restoration, vegetation management, habitat enhancement, there's cultural burning. There are a lot of different ways that you can apply prescribed fire for a lot of different reasons and in a lot of different habitats. It's a very important tool. And the more we learn about it, the more we think about it being used as in conjunction with thinning. And sometimes we're looking at using it as a first entry tool, right? You really maybe you just bringing fire back in some situations. And this is kind of the idea. Fire suppressed forest, when it burns a higher severity at a larger area than we want. So the idea is that if we're managing these forest systems for ecological resilience and health, removing some of that biomass so that when we intentionally burn it or when wildfire burns it, the fire does not result in stand replacement or significant impact to the dominant canopy. So this is an example of a landowner who you know, had been working on a cost share incentives program, had been thinning the understory and followed up that thinning with the prescribed burn. And so here we have these this really nice open spaced out Douglas fir forest where the charring on this bark is actually from the prescribed fire. But what was really amazing about this particular unit project was that, right, we thinned, he had the lantern thinned, and then we had prescribed burned it. Within a year, the glass fire came through. And so this is a ranch road. On the right side is outside of the original management unit with the prescribed burn. On the right side is the prescribed burn. This is from the glass fire. So within a year of implementing those management practices in this particular area, the glass fire came through. This is on the Sonoma side of the glass fire. So this was the wind-driven event. What we have on the right, on the left side is pretty significant fire effects, which, and I want to emphasize, there were no fire suppression resources on site at the time of this fire. This was this property landowner. 99% of the infrastructure on the property was destroyed, and there was nobody there. On the right side, the only thing, the grass didn't burn. I'm at a loss here. This is an amazing example of how active stewardship and using multiple treatment options can create very healthy, resilient forest structure that, with no interference from suppression, was able to actually not even burn during a pretty extreme wildfire event. So, I mean, this is a really solid case study of how these kinds of forest management practices can actually have really significant impacts on the health and resiliency of our forest structure. So to just kind of pull that together, right? So forest lands are dynamic, they're always changing. Disturbances are incredibly important. Fire is probably our most important disturbance. You know, I don't have to reiterate to you because you all are doing it already, but you got to develop a plan. You got to think about how you're going to think about managing your forest lands, whether it's for wildfire resiliency or health or whatever your goals and objectives are. That includes active stewardship. You work with your professionals. There's a lot of resource and knowledge out there on the landscape to help, you know, inform these decision-making processes and make good management decisions. And perhaps most importantly, as you all know, this is not a one and done, right? Forest management, vegetation maintenance, or vegetation management is an ongoing commitment, and maintenance is crucial, right? It's not just like you're gonna go thin the forest one time and you're done. You got to come back and make sure you're continuously implementing some kind of management practices to maintain the structure. All right, that is my talk. I don't know how you want to do questions. I know there's Q&A at the end. I can stop share and then we can move on and come back, or I can take questions now, whatever you all are interested in.
What do you think, Bruce?
I think it's maybe a good time to take a quick pause and receive questions. Marie, you okay with that?
Yeah, that sounds great.
So questions, please.
Yeah. Okay.
Looks like we have Clint Kellner, please.
I'm concerned about the management of the understory vegetation for wildfire and its effect on the animals that live in the understory. Say, for instance, for orange crowned warblers that nest in the understory, it doesn't matter if there's a forest there or not. If there's no understory, they're not going to nest. So I'm wondering what you think of the idea of leaving patches of understory or patches of corridors, so the animals can move from one place to the other and provide at least some habitat for the predators that eat wood rats and so forth.
Absolutely, I cannot agree with you more. That's a really important part of this vegetation management, thinking about the wildlife impacts, right? This is a disturbance we are coming in and actively managing, so we will create a disturbance. And I absolutely agree with you. I love the idea of little patches, little islands and patches. I love the idea of corridors. It's not realistically, the kind of management we're talking about is not something that is going to be treating more than a very small fraction of the entire forest land. It's strategic. And within that framework, we're also thinking about leaving habitat. And in my mind, the purpose is to break up the continuity of fuel, right? We're not completely creating a park, and not everything's as sanitized as that picture I showed on, kind of what your goals and objectives are for removing slash, but we are creating heterogeneity in that forest structure and the composition. And that includes leaving ladder fuels in areas where you can do so safely. That includes leaving shrubby brush. That includes letting high severity wildfire come through and kill some dominant trees that open it up to create habitat for different species that use different forest structure. I am all for that. Yeah, I definitely want heterogeneity in my forest structure, and especially in the way we manage our forests through active management.
That was a great question, Clint. And Maria, if you don't mind, I'll just, if okay with you, I'll just call Nona. I see that you were second, and then Paul Silva, please.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I looked at the illustrations. As you speak of the need, of course, for regeneration, but I see in the examples shown, very little evidence of different age classes in the recruitment, different age classes in the recruitment trees. I just see very little left.
Yeah.
Recruitment.
No, that's a really good point.
Further explain that?
Yeah, I mean, these are just diagrams. These are not, I'm not prescribing or suggesting that we need to sanitize the understory that much. I do agree that part of what, I think she has her
What happened to
plugged
her?
in.
Oh yeah, I'll put my
Can you hear me?
earphones back on.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm not
okay.
prescribing, the complete removal of the understory. I don't actually agree with that either. These are just diagrams to try to convey an idea. I absolutely agree. We need multiple cohorts. We need multiple age classes. It's again about breaking up the continuity of those fuels. You can leave places where you have lots of small trees in the understory, and we need them, right? The oak woodlands, not all of them, but blue oaks, for example, are struggling significantly with regeneration. So I'm not saying we need to go cut out all the understory oaks and blue oak woodlands, but it's just about changing the structure. It's not about specifically targeting one size class or one species. It's about modifying the distribution of those trees across the landscape in a way that makes them more resilient to disturbance. And also at the same time, creating that infrastructure that makes it sustainable so that as the big trees die off naturally, there's something to replace them.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks.
Paul.
Paul, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, fascinating presentation and very illuminating. But one of the areas where information, new information is appearing with amazing frequency is in Chaparral. I remember when I first started teaching, the prevailing wisdom was that we needed to have more fire in Chaparral. And now I think even in the table you presented, I think the figure for mean fire frequency is 30 years, and people are saying some chaparral has to go for 70 or more years and then have a big conflagration and replace itself. How does chaparral fit into the picture for management?
Oh man, that's a great question.
Sorry, it's a hard question.
I mean, I think I'm going to punt a little bit on that one, and maybe this requires alcohol. I think this one needs to be over beer or wine.
Yeah. Can I just interject here, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely.
We're not going to address chaparral in this webinar period. There's if immediate next to homes, defensible space 0 to 5 feet, and out to 30, that you may do some management. There are no proposals to manage chaparral right now under NPA. So I think it's something we just need to skip. And when we go down to Southern California and get the real chaparral experts, we can have a much more detailed discussion. But let's not put time into chaparral stuff today, please.
Oh, okay, thanks.
And I just out of respect for time, there are a couple of chat questions. And David, you have a question. If it's quick, let's go. But I think we're going to have to move on just out of respect for everyone's time here.
Yeah, hopefully it's quick. Michael, your illustrations are what I'll call mostly cross-sectional data right after the time of the treatment. And yet you talk about, we have a living system which evolves. And my concern is, what do these evolve into? What do they look like 5 years after the treatment? Where are the native plants? Where is the habitat for wildlife? What is the interval for retreatment, for getting rid of invasive plants that may have been introduced? It's the dynamic, the living organism of the forest as once it's cut that I'm concerned about, and we haven't really talked about that.
Well, I mean, that's a really good point. And I mentioned at the very end that maintenance is crucial, and maintenance is crucial because these things recover like crazy, right? As soon as you cut, if you cut, as you all know, if you cut any hardwood that occurs on the coast or a redwood down, it sprouts immediately. And as soon as you open up growing space, something will occupy that space. So these systems are incredibly resilient to any kind of disturbance. They come back robust. And you know, as long as we're not aggressively removing all the native vegetation, we can, through, you know, these are like light touch, right? This is a light touch kind of management perception that, or perception, not perception, but a light like implementation. The idea is to facilitate and encourage and recruit the native vegetation that already occurs in that site, and do it in such a way that we're not making it so that invasive species more readily invade these areas. We're doing it in such a way that we're just supporting and creating healthy native habitat structure. And I think, you know, the disturbance through implementation of field reduction management is another type of disturbance that doesn't have the same impact, but it is a disturbance, and it has the same effect on the vegetation that, say, wildfire or insects or diseases would, to some extent.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Mike. These are difficult questions. But let's see, I think Marie, do you want to move on to introduce our next speaker, and we'll take questions yet again, and then we have a fourth speaker, and then we can just maybe take some closing questions towards the end. So Marie, this is your show.
Yeah, Paul, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, and we can move on to your segment.
Hey, good afternoon again. Paul Lowenthal with the San Jose Fire Department. Thanks for being here. And Michael, thank you for the information. And I know we got to get to Carl too. So I was asked to kind of focus in a little bit more on shaded fuel breaks and how they work, or how they didn't work within our community following the Tubbs, Nuns, and Glass fires specifically within our community. And then also how the Kincaid fire, and really all four fires, kind of directly and indirectly affected our community, how it pushed our community from where we were in 17 to where we were in 20, and where we're going. So with that, I'll briefly show you a video just to kind of remember what the conditions were like that we were facing in the Tubbs and Nuns fire. This was that October night. As you can see, the ember cast, regardless of the work that was or wasn't doing, definitely played a role in our community, and really not just the ember cast, but the overall ability for our community to react to the fire. So with that, following the night, this is what we ended up with in Fountain Grove. Scene after scene, devastated neighborhood after devastated neighborhood. And what you see here is what really should have been a community set up for success. You've got golf courses, you have thinned out fuels, you have a lot of good defensible space in some cases, but really just block after block after block of homes that were destroyed. And again, here's a wildland area immediately up against the neighborhood, and you don't see complete destruction of the canopy. It was a lot of surface fire that pushed into these neighborhoods because there had been a ton of work that had been done in these communities. In some areas that work was successful, and in other cases it was not. Here at the top of the screen is actually next to that water tank was our fire station 5. That was a brand new fire station built to current standards. That was completely destroyed, as well as our old fire station 5, and really, as you can see everywhere you look, destroyed neighborhood after destroyed neighborhood. And eventually pushed out of our wildland urban interface and into our densely populated communities, namely Coffee Park. where we ended up with, again, a significant amount of destruction, where it was no longer a wildland fire, and it was just really structure to structure and a full interface fire. Had the winds not stopped that morning, that fire would have likely progressed through most of Santa Rosa. But given that conditions improved and winds literally stopped that morning, for the most part, Santa Rosa was saved. So now quickly fast forwarding to the glass fire. And again, we'll come back and talk about the differences in both. But again, very similar conditions with the way things were burning. But the big difference to support the shaded fuel breaks was actually having resources. And not only in open areas where fuel work had been done, but also, like you can see here, embers raining down onto neighborhoods. So again, the difference between what we saw following the 17 fires and the 20 fires, the 17 we saw complete destruction. 20 fires, we saw destruction, but not to the scale that we had seen. This is Skyhawk, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen pictures of and case studies on. We saw where work worked and where it didn't. And from Rincon Valley or Skyhawk out into Oakmont. And Oakmont, another community that had done a tremendous amount of work. Mostly, although a lot of work had been done prior to the 17 fires, really they escalated their work, became a FireWise community, and did a significant amount of fuel management, vegetation management, weed abatement, grazing, and it only ended up with about 6 residential units destroyed in that part of our community. So what was the big differences between 17 and 20? So some of those improvements were early detection, meaning our ability to detect the fire. And then with early detection becomes early ability to alert and warn people. The overall collaborative efforts of all our respective agencies working much better together. The way we responded, like you saw in one of the videos, our operational enhancements and equipment being able to get into those areas. And we'll come back and we'll touch on this a little bit briefly, but the purpose of this is to talk about just why a fuel break or a shaded fuel break could work and why it couldn't work. And the fuel breaks clearly didn't work the way we wanted them to work in 17, but we didn't have a lot of these improvements and we didn't have really a community that was set up for success. The community engagement enhancement is really what got us to where we are today. And that community engagement played a big role in our Community Wildfire Protection Plan, our CWPP. And that CWPP has truly laid out the roadmap for our community and why fuel treatments and shaded fuel breaks are occurring, being improved and continuing to be put in place across our community. Our CWPP truly is in the weeds, no pun intended. There's some community wildfire protection plans that are very generic, global, look at things globally and allow an agency or an organization to point to and seek grant funding. Our CWPP really does get into the weeds and talks about very specific field treatments and needs based on different parts of our community. And although a lot of these names probably don't mean a lot to some of the people on this webinar, but it gets into whether it's the Montecito neighborhood or Skyhawk or Oakmont, Bennett Valley, a lot of very different specific community neighborhoods with different concerns, different treatment needs, and recommendations for each one of those. But again, a lot of these are listed here because these truly did play a part in how the shaded fuel breaks worked or didn't work. The preparations that residents have taken through a lot of our campaigns that we put together. There's a lot of tools in the toolbox and a lot of outreach, new campaigns that we've come up with here locally, whether it's our improvements to our evacuation checklists, our improvements to what measures residents can take around their own homes, home hardening, All those really have to be in place in order to make the treatments work in most cases, with the exception of what Mike talked about earlier, where he had his case study where it worked perfectly without anything. We can't rely on that here in a populated community. So what are shaded field breaks? And it's kind of interesting if you've done any research on them, that you'll see so many different definitions and so many different ideas of what they are. You look at the NWCG that looks at the national field break as a field break built in the timberland areas where trees on the break are thinning or pruned to reduce fire potential, yet remain enough crown canopy to make a less favorable microclimate for surface fires. Or you look at Colorado States that talks about the break is an easily accessible strip of land of varying width depending on fuel and terrain, in which density is reduced, thus improving fire control opportunities. Or the fire service, who looks at a well-designed fuel break, will alter the fire behavior of wildland fire entering the fuel altered zone. And although there's a lot of different definitions, there's one thing that we know is that there really is no standard, because there could be so many different variables for what is needed for a given location. And it's really going to depend on what your specific conditions are, whether 50 feet may work, or whether 100 feet may work, or maybe it's a matter of 15 feet or 20 feet. The conditions that you have in your particular neighborhood or your particular area are going to drive what is needed to reduce that potential. So looking specifically at one of our associations, the OSMA, the Open Space Maintenance Association within Fountain Grove. This is a community that has invested a lot of time and energy. This is a community that our department has been working with closely for years, and well before the Tubbs fire swept through Fountain Grove. We would work with them annually on their vegetation management, their field breaks, their grazing, their weed abatement. We'd attend meetings with them, review their work plans, and the amount of work that they did ahead of the Tubbs fire was remarkable. I actually remember, I'm also our department's public information officer, and did a lot of work both before, during, and after the Tubbs fire, and continue to do a lot of it. But the Today Show actually set up one of their sets for their morning show in Fountain Grove. And they used one of these hillsides that's identified here, that's within the OSMA's responsibility, as a backdrop to their morning show. And during our live interview, they said how hard it must be for us to look at this and realize all the efforts that could have been put in place and should have been put in place, and kind of pointed to the hill behind us. And I stopped them and I said, this actually was a completely maintained, a completely controlled area. The weeds, the undergrowth was down to stubble, the vegetation was maintained, the trees were limbed. This was an area that did exactly what it should have done, but given the conditions that we were dealing with that night and the lack of preparedness that our community had, those shaded field breaks didn't do anything for them. But it did work in some areas. This is one of the areas where hundreds of thousands of dollars has been spent on well within the OSMA's boundaries on the leeward side of where the Tubbs fire pushed. So this was an area that was susceptible to ember cast and spread, and eventually fire was established in this open space, and it moved uphill. And as you can see, this is one of the few areas where homes are still in place, where they still are were not subjected to fire. They also weren't directly in the wind's path, but the burning that occurred in this area was able to move uphill at a kind of a relatively low intensity. In some cases, yes, there was some isolated torching, but really it did what we wanted it to do, and it held, and a lot of these homes made it without any damage other than smoke. And so we saw this a lot throughout the Tubbs fire burn scar in specific parts of Fountain Grove. And some of it was luck, and some of it was because it did what it was supposed to do. And again, it was a little bit protected from the wind element. Other areas didn't do so well. And so with that, that homeowners association, or that open space management association, is doing a tremendous amount of work, and they continue to do a lot of work. They are putting in massive breaks in a lot of their dead standing trees to reduce those areas down to just seasonal grasses, where a lot of that standing fuel is eventually, like we're seeing in other parts that you'll see in the slide, just collapsing and deteriorating, so that it's something that can be easily managed with a lot of grazing activities that they partake in. There's other areas that were completely devastated, where now regrowth has, without a canopy, is changing our ecology and changing how things are regrowing. And so where they used to do shaded field breaks, they're, you know, with a lot of the thinning of the trees, they're now left with just dead standing trees and a lot of just invasive species that are growing and kind of taking over the land. You'll see a lot of burn piles that are set up here now, and this is a little deceiving. This is a very deep, inaccessible kind of canyon that dives off pretty drastically, and the ability for our community to put in fuel breaks, especially in areas like this, is pretty limited and costly. So the city of Santa Rosa has never actually allowed burning to take place in the city limits historically. With that, under our community wildfire protection plan, it did identify a need to establish a burn ordinance. And so that is one of the things that we're doing in some of our larger open space areas, is to allow for burning, for pile burning to take place on a case-by-case basis on parcels over 5 acres in size, where the ability for them to burn makes it accessible and feasible for them to actually do fuel treatment within their budgets. Obviously, what you see right there is a very drastic line between what's being maintained and what is not. And what is not being maintained and presenting a new challenge for our ability to put breaks in place is non-city lands. In this particular case, this is county private property that abuts the city of Santa Rosa. And so we have the city doing, city residents doing their part with the funds that they have through an HOA, essentially, and then unimproved lands following the Tubbs fire. And then so you'll see in some cases, it's actually worse, the fuel loading that is occurring from dead and dying trees, as well as the fuels on the ground, is actually worse than it was prior to the 2017 fires, where a lot of our areas were open grass woodlands with a really healthy canopy. Whereas now, without the canopy in place, we're just getting taken over by Scotch broom, French broom, bay, and anything and everything that you can imagine that's just increasing the fuel load within a lot of our canyons. What makes that difficult for us is that there's a lot of good work that's being done within the community, but we're only as good as some of our weak spots, and some of our weak points within and around Santa Rosa are becoming more and more prevalent. So again, you cannot just rely on the shaded fuel break. The fuel breaks alone, like we saw, especially in the Tubbs fire, without just, let alone defensible space and home hardening, you can't be successful, knowing that you need to have all the elements, the defensible space, the home hardening, the early notification. And the early notification for us played a huge role in why our shaded fuel breaks were so successful in the 20 fires. The fire moved through a lot of those areas in and around the Oakmont area, and they did exactly what we wanted to see. They burned healthy, they burned through them, but the ember cast that rained down on those neighborhoods lacked fuels. Homeowners had done their defensible space. Homeowners had hardened their structures. They had gutter guards in place. They had vent screens in place. They'd done everything we wanted, and we, as an agency, we're able to get that early notification in place based on a lot of our improvements from the wildfire cameras, from the ways that we operate now much differently, which enabled our residents to implement their evacuation checklists and give us the opportunity to get in the neighborhoods after they had the opportunity to get out safely. So we saw drastic improvements on why those breaks worked in 20 versus where we were in 17. Clearly, we still have a lot of work to do. This is a very unfortunate common sight for us around Santa Rosa right now. Even though there are, like I said, some areas under the responsibility of either the Oakmont Village Association or the Open Space Maintenance Association or the Bennett Valley Homeowner Association, there's a lot of areas that through HOAs have been able to do a lot of good work, but we're struggling with how to put in our brakes based on what we're seeing here locally. So we're starting to get creative, and we're going to have to get creative because of what we're seeing. So we're looking at language now that we'll likely be implementing. And when I keep saying we, like there's somebody else going to work on it for me. But we're going to be looking at ordinance language that's going to start requiring the removal of dead and downed trees, as well as invasive species of whether it's Scotch broom, French broom, bay, whatever the case may be, along roadways of all of our fire scars. In an effort to, again, create different types of breaks, both for evacuation, for fire suppression, because the conditions that we're being left with right now are just not favorable. And again, in a lot of cases, you can argue that the fuels and the fuel loading that's occurring is way worse today than it was just in 2017. So ultimately, our goal, we saw in the Tubbs and Nuns fire, the number of fatalities, the Tubbs fire specifically with the acreage burn, the structures. In the city alone, 9 fatalities, just under 3,100 structures destroyed. And although we weren't directly impacted by the Kincaid and Walbridge fires, our community saw them. And our community looked at what happened to us in 17, watched what happened during the Kincaid, and really has stepped up and has done a tremendous amount of work and got us to where we were in the 20 fires with the Shady. Now there's areas, obviously during the glass fire, and I'm sure you've heard talks on them, where we saw what led to a lot of the destruction in the glass fire, where fire was carried by people that, and I'll use the Skyhawk open space as an example. That's an area that a lot of good work was done by homeowners and residents, fuel breaks around homes, defensible space. But then you can have one resident who doesn't have the defensible space, that hasn't done their part to limb trees up or reduce fuel loading. And that fire can carry out of seasonal grasses uphill and then run into a home, and then ultimately destroy almost an entire block of homes. And so our goal is to continue to educate, to continue to show the benefits of those field treatments, to seek grant funding, to implement projects and programs throughout our community, to hopefully get to where the next fires that we have, although we didn't have any fatalities in the glass fire, we want to get that structure count down to where we're having fires, but not structure loss. We started to see that last year. Last year in Santa Rosa, we ended up with more acreage burned in the city limits than I had seen in my 22, 23 years with the city of Santa Rosa. But with the exception of the Tubbs fire, the Nuns fire, and the glass fire. But the difference between those fires and the other fires that we've had in the past is that although we had multiple 5-acre, 8-acre, and 50-acre fires in the city limits, we didn't have any structural damage. And for us, that was huge. And we were actually seeing a lot of those fires that were burning in our community were bumping up against shaded field breaks, breaks in seasonal grasses, breaks in vegetation, and were allowing us to take action. So we were implementing our evacuation plans, getting people out of harm's way, getting resources in, and using those breaks to affect positive outcomes. And so that's really become our goal with our community. Our council, city council, kickstarted our vegetation management program in the city, which launched officially about 2019, 2020, with $5.25 million that came out of our PG&E vegetation management, PG&E funds through our settlement. With that, we're applying for and receiving grants now, finally. We were pretty unsuccessful with grant funding prior to and after the 17 fires. Now since December, we finally looking at receiving several millions and millions of dollars worth of grants for evacuation routes, for home hardening, for education outreach, and our ability to educate on, again, shaded field breaks is going to be one of our priorities, and where we're going to be investing a lot of what is our new HCD grant through Housing and Community Development. We'll have another $500,000 that will help educate on those type of benefits. So with that, tried to move through it quickly because I know it's already 3:36. I know we got one more presentation and questions to answer. So sorry for rushing that, but thank you and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think that we're going to move directly to Carl's presentation just to make sure he has enough time. And then we'll do questions for Paul and Carl at the end. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can everyone see this?
Yes, sir.
Awesome.
Thank you, Maria.
Mhm.
Paul, thank you much. Michael, thank you very much. That was a great background on some of the science and methodology behind fuels and forest health. I've been asked to take a more local approach, and I was going to provide some background on what Marin Water is doing specifically related to forest health and our recent work around fuels modeling. Next slide, please. As part of our modeling interests, we're looking at identifying our values at risk, and those are values within our wildland areas, such as our treatment plant. And we're looking at simulating wildfire behavior under varying weather conditions, also under varying treatment types and locations. We're going to, we'll show you a pilot project, but we're going to be evaluating at a landscape level the efficiency of our current and planned fuel treatments. That is in terms of how they affect fire behavior and fire growth with and without those treatments. We'll have the ability to analyze the probability of loss with those different treatments and provide recommendations on the location and type and fuel treatment, the type of fuel treatment to reduce that loss going forward. Next slide. So just background on the problem that we have. This is a shot of Kent Lake and Bolinas Ridge on the left, San Geronimo Ridge, Pine Mountain area on the right. A big part of our fuel problem is the abundance of dead and dying tan oak. That is a primary fuel load for us in the understory and on the ground fuels now. And one of our goals as part of our vegetation plan, our BIFIP, which we adopted in 2019, is to improve forest health and resiliency through reducing the fuel loads of sudden oak impacted forests. In terms of some of the research that we base our work on in terms of the treatments, was work conducted by U.S. Forest Service, Cal Poly, and UC Davis on initial forest resilience plots, mostly along Bolinas Ridge and Ridgecrest Boulevard, where we continue to monitor the change over time to those forest units where we treated for mostly sudden oak death. Next slide, please. As an example of the type of environmental compliance and pre-project work that we do quite a bit of pre-project surveys within any of our shaded fuel breaks prior to conducting work. This is take a look at this map here. This is an area around Potrero Meadows. For those of you familiar with Mount Tamalpais, it's on the north slope of the mountain below East and West Peak. The different work areas and demonstration areas here comprise about 70 acres. Each of the various symbols, stars, and circles represent points where we either have rare plants, bats, nesting birds, or roosting bat habitat. And these all add to the heterogeneity of the work that we conduct as each of these points become avoidance areas as we conduct the work moving forward. Next slide. Again, more on the environmental compliance. Again, prior to conducting work, all the crews, both the contract and staff, are given pre-project trainings regarding the compliance efforts and avoidance methodology. Prior to conducting work, we're looking at the hydrology, the geology and biology, as well as the cultural resources that may be present. If needed on cultural resources, we do meet with a figure of the tribes for consultation as needed. We have extensive northern spotted owl survey information across the watershed that we use for setting up appropriate avoidance measures. Immediately prior to all of the work during nesting season, which runs January through August, we conduct nesting bird surveys and avoid nesting birds or any nesting behavior as appropriate. And we're looking at roosting bats and wildlife, and certainly rare plants. And we're this year alone, I think we're conducting rare plant surveys over 1,000 acres of property on Mount Tam. Next slide. Again, just some examples of local treatments around Potrero Meadow. Both Michael and Paul talked about this, but this again is an example of a shaded fuel break around the meadow. We're staying out of the meadow proper. On the slide on the left, we're using heavy equipment to masticate. And the slide on the right, we're giving a pre-crew training to the state CC crew out of Ukiah that's going to be coming in and following up that machinery work, doing some hand work. Next slide. Again, just some local examples of how we're reducing the horizontal and vertical continuity of fuels in the understory. In this case, we're focused mostly on sudden oak death and the resultant dead and dying tan oaks that become the primary fuel in this forest. We have taken out quite a bit of small Douglas fir as well. And the slide on the right is the work afterwards. Next slide. Another example of this of the similar work in the same area. As Michael pointed out, numerous slides up north. Again, we've left a lot of large standing trees. We've left different age classes. Importantly, too, habitat on the ground. We have a number of heavy woody debris, but we've also reduced the fuel bed or ground fuels by masticating them in place. So this is not going to carry a ground fire. Next slide. All right, so now onto the modeling. So you saw the areas that I presented in the earlier slide. As part of a One Tam Forest Health Initiative, we took and as a pilot project, conducted fuels modeling and fire behavior modeling over these same areas. This was conducted by Tuckman and Carol Rice using 2020 county fuel model data. Part of that was based on LiDAR derivatives that gave us good information on the pre-treatment forest structure. That is the canopy height of the ground fuels and ladder fuels and overall canopy height as well. We went into these varying work areas with the avoidance measures in place and treated the forest fuels over about 70 acres. And that's just for scale, that 70 acres represents 70 acres of 7,000 similar acres on the watershed that we manage. So it's a pretty small scale project. And the results from the fuel modeling using Flame Map, which is a US Forest Service software product, we dramatically lowered the predicted fire behavior, and we greatly decreased the flame lengths or the rate of spread on post-treatment. Next slide. This is a good visualization of that. Slide on the left is pre-treatment, slide on the right is post-treatment modeling. Example here would be that the flame length in the pre-treatment was modeled in the range of 4 to 20 foot in length as a wildland fire would move through. Post-treatment, flame lengths were modeled at less than 2 feet. Next slide. Another example or output of our modeling was fire spread or rate of spread. Pre-treatment, we had rates of spread from 4 to 18 feet. And post-treatment within these same units, we had rates of spread that were modeled at less than 4 feet per minute. So dramatically reduced fire behavior pre and post-treatment. Next slide. Again, just in being brief, I'll just summarize it here. Our fuel reduction outcomes, or at least what our desired outcomes, by reducing the stand density, which is what you saw in those shaded fuel breaks. We're reducing the competition amongst the existing vegetation, which results in increased tree vigor or the growth of the remaining trees, that larger, bigger trees. The fuel reduction also leads to a decrease in fire behavior or fire intensity. which has a resulting reduction in fire severity or impact to the vegetation. All of this adds to a tactical advantage for if you're responding to a wildland fire in these areas, if the fire is not burning as hot or as intense or as fast. We're never saying to stop a fire or prevent a fire. We are focused on changing the fire behavior within treated areas. And from a forest health perspective, this work also increases both the fire and drought resistance of these stands overall. And just in being brief, that's what I've got for you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Carl. So we have about 15 minutes left for questions, if anyone has questions. Clint?
I've noticed that a number of park agencies have done similar vegetation management in their county open spaces. And these parks are quite distant from structures. And so I was wondering, wouldn't it be better to focus on home hardening, defensible space, and then a shaded fuel break in the vicinity right next to the homes than clearing understory out in the middle of wildlands? And that anybody can answer that question. I'm just curious about your.
Clint, I can at least start with why we work in the wildlands. We actually do both. We work at the interface quite a bit. We as the water district, and we work on defensible space and what we call primary fuel breaks that abut communities such as Kentfield, San Anselmo, Fairfax, San Andromeda Valley. The work that we do in the wildlands is actually still part of larger scale fuel breaks, but it also has a very secondary and important benefit of adding to forest health overall. So I would say that we do both.
And I can tag on to that a little bit. And I'm so glad you asked that question, Clint, because it really is part of our approach that we've taken with the MWPA, and we're calling it the systems approach, starting with the houses, starting with home hardening and defensible space. And then the next step is also evacuation route clearing, so that when people are evacuating, that they, traffic jam during an evacuation in a wildfire is inevitable. It is, these road networks are not designed to handle that many cars at once. So our goal is that anytime someone's on an evacuation route in a car, it will be survivable in the car. And then we are embarking upon shaded fuel breaks right along the wildland urban interface boundary. The Greater Ross Valley Shaded Fuel Break is an example of that. But then you couple that with the greater forest health projects. And an analogy that was shared with me is the traffic safety, or the vehicle safety devices that are built into our cars. And you can say that seat belts are like home hardening and defensible space. That is that safety protection device that is close to your life. Then you take the airbags, whether it's the front airbags or the side airbags. That's the buffer that's giving you some protection should an accident happen. That's our shaded fuel breaks along the wildland urban interface boundary. That's our evacuation route clearings. And then a lot of the vehicles now have traffic collision avoidance systems, whether it's a lane awareness or it's automatically braking your car before an accident happens. To me, that's the forest health aspect of it, because many of these fires that are turning into urban conflagrations, they're happening in these unhealthy forests. They are allowed to create a tremendous amount of energy that nothing is going to stop it when they come into our communities. And so we need all of those components to work together, because when you get in your car with all of those safety devices, since you have airbags, you don't make a decision not to wear your seatbelt. So what our whole approach is that we need to use all of these systems together. It's not going to guarantee we won't have fires, in the same way these avoidance or the traffic safety systems don't guarantee we won't have a vehicle accident. And you will be injured if you're in a vehicle accident, quite likely. but your injuries will be very moderate compared to if none of those systems were in place. So we really think it has to be a complete approach. And MWPA really right now is focusing on the homes out to the wildland urban interface boundaries. And we're looking for our land management agencies really to look at the forest health in the greater wildlands.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'd just like to tag on to what Mark said with just 2 points. Some of the photos that Paul showed are of dead standing wood and 100% cover of broom. And that is a very common sight in some of the unmanaged areas that burned in the Glass, the Wall Bridge, and other fires. So that landscape is the natives are getting outcompeted by the broom, and really very little that's native is growing in a lot of those areas. A lot of the areas that have seen some sort of management fared fairly well. And I refer to Mike's photos of areas where some forest management and prescribed burning had occurred. And that's in the Mark West Creek watershed, an area that several of us know very well. And then, so I think in terms of long-term resilience of our wildlands, we need to do a better job of stewarding those wildlands. Right now, prescribed burns on their own without some sort of intervention beforehand would be, a bit risky because sometimes you need to do some fuel reduction before you put a good fire on the ground. I went recently to some tribal lands on a tour to see what they're doing to manage their forests. This was just last week. And one of the elders in the tribe said, in reaction to, why don't you just start doing prescribed burns? They said, are you crazy? We've had 100 years of fuel buildup. We can't just start burning the landscape until we manage our forests first. The other thing I want to just say is that without some sort of fuel reduction and stewardship, the likelihood that a fire is going to be high severity is higher, which means that you're going to impact the soils long-term, potentially have hydrophobic soils on steep slopes that can then lead to slope instability and landslides and hydrophobic conditions that can be a real problem around, say, neighborhoods, homes on steep slopes, roadways, reservoirs, and other facilities that are then at risk. And then that's a really big issue that we saw in Santa Rosa, trying to predict if the next atmospheric river was going to be resulting in some serious hazards post-fire. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. Belle, do you have a question?
Yes. My question really is to all of you, the speakers, both in forest health and in your methodologies and your treatment. How do you take reduction of emissions and sequestration into account? And how do you measure it, and what kind of priority do you give it? I'm sure there are various answers to that. I just noticed that it never came up in the discussion, so I'd like to have some understanding of where you think that stands. That's Paul and Carl and Mike.
Bill, I mean, I could give you a stab at that, and I think I mentioned this in an earlier conversation.
Yeah.
Often the carbon goals are at odds with the initial fuel work, but certainly are in line with the long-term approach when you're looking at catastrophic fires, carbon release versus the carbon release that may occur during an initial treatment and maybe decay of the slash afterwards. So again, there's a bit of a trade-off, but again, we're looking at a long-term approach in terms of the forest vigor and the ability of a healthy forest to retain carbon in large trees, for example.
If I can just add to that, emissions associated with wildfires in 2020 in California were incredibly high. The average over the last 2 decades in terms of CO2 emissions from wildfires in California were around 14 million metric tons. I know I'm very nerdy by having this in my head right now, but 14 million metric tons was the annual average in the last 20 years. However, in 2020, we were well over 100 million metric tons. So the emissions from these wildfires are going up. And this is a problem because then we have this feedback loop of emissions contributing to climate change contributing to more wildfires. So I think that's something we need to consider. Also doing a little thinning and a little management around some of these trees that then are allowed to grow more quickly and at greater rates once you've thinned out that broom and some of the competing invasive understory. Then you're going to see more carbon sequestration, and the Carbon Forest Plan has some great data on that and how much additional carbon gets sequestered in those mature trees.
I'll add on one more thing from our work at Marin Water. I think you heard Carl mention that Richard Cobb is one of the researchers out of Cal Poly now who was involved early on in our thinning work and taking measurements. And what he found in his plots and his crew is that there really was no significant reduction in basal area in the thin stands. In other words, if what you're taking out is a bunch of tiny things, your big trees are really where all your basal area is. So that's one proxy for carbon storage. So you can reduce density dramatically, the number of stems, without really having any change in basal area. The other thing is a really sort of inconvenient reality that's coming out of some of the research, I think this is out of the Scott Stevens lab, that in some locations, depending on exactly sort of how drought, the future of droughts, the carrying capacity, the actual carbon storage capacity of some of our forests may be reduced in the future. And that's just, if you, the water, what's going on with our moisture is going to determine how many trees that place can support. So that's sort of a little bit of a tangent from your question, but just sort of a background for us to keep in mind. That's a really hard truth about climate change. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, well, we are at 3:58. If anyone has any more questions, we've got about 2 more minutes. Last call. Clint?
I've got lots of questions, but one of them is there was a study done on Paradise which indicated that that there was a lot of fuel reduction and controlled burning in Paradise, but the fire in Paradise really burned quickly through the woods and onto the town of Paradise. I wonder if you guys have any reactions to that and how to manage for something like that.
I can address a little bit of that. I was the operations section chief for the Camp Fire and was in Paradise as the fire was burning through Paradise. I was also on numerous previous fires in and around Paradise for the last 2 decades. And some of the reports and the information that's been shared has not been looking at the entire picture. It's really been spit picking small data points and then applying that small data point to the overall picture there. And so it'd be like the Caldor fire is a good example. The Caldor fire had historic rates of spread. The Caldor fire did something that only one other fire had done, and that was the Dixie fire, and that's crest the Sierra Nevada divide. But there were some excellent examples of forest health work in the Caldor fire. You can say, well, look, there was forest health work, and then the Caldor fire burned in an explosive way, so therefore it doesn't work. But the fact of the matter is, it was only about 5% of the space of the Caldor fire that had the forest management work, and so the fire burned intensively despite the work, not because of the work. And the same is true in Paradise. That study was only looking at 5+% of the area in and around Paradise. that had been treated and or logged or had previous fire footprints. There was still a very continuous fuel bed going into Paradise.
I wanted to ask if, Terry, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? Because I noticed your hand was up.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. No, I'm fine. I kind of answered my own question. Thanks, everybody. This was a really great session.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, well, it is 4 o'clock, so I think that's a wrap. But I want to say thank you to Carl, Paul, and Michael for taking on these difficult discussions and bringing all of your expertise. We can give them a little virtual clap out here. Thank you so much, everyone. This was great. I know I, for one, learned a lot today.
Sean, did you have a question?
Oh, no,
Oh,
I'll do
I
my
think
virtual
everyone's
clap.
clapping.
Okay, well, that's great.
So,
So thanks everybody for coming. And I think kind of learning about the science of and the choices and the experience in what you're doing has been really impressive, and we've learned a lot. So thank you very much. Talk to you all soon.
Thank you for having me. Great group, great questions.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael.
You
Thank
all.
you, Carl,
Thank
Paul.
you so much.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye. Okay. Are we going to end this? I guess so. Thank you.
Got the controls, Bill.
Bye.
Hey, Bill,
Yo, yeah.
stay on for a sec. Let's
I
chat.
will. I will. I'm glad you're there, Mike. Yeah. 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 That's okay. But is
I
it
think Pam and Nona walked away from their.
okay? But we can, can we talk?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll leave. Let me close.
So how long have you been back?
Oh, I got back. When did I got back last Monday.
Uh-huh.
No, I didn't. I got back Wednesday. Yeah. So I've been here.
And how long were you away?
I was gone 7 days. Yeah. It was fantastic.
Great.
Yeah, it was wonderful. And I'm leaving again on Friday for going up to Washington. I have another granddaughter who's this time graduating from college. So, and so it's, I'm glad that it went well. Don't you think this?
Yeah.
Discussion?
Yeah. I think there's still people have concerns that I don't think were addressed fully about habitat.
Yeah.
And, I think David Long kind of phrased it well. I mean, looking at whole forest ecosystems and how they change through time. But so, kind of addressing that, I think will be helpful.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't have to be the last discussion of this. In fact, it seems like, I mean, some of the big controversial issues didn't come up that they were ready for. So,
well, they're sort of, I mean, Clint raised the one that I think came out of the Chad Hansen's work about that thinning the forests accelerated fire spread and made it worse. I just think it's just kind of
17 versus 20, he said. Yeah.
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 But that gets into the detail about studies and people start going to sleep. But I think it's important, and and some of the work, but say what the water district's doing is oh yeah, that for sure. But they can adapt their approaches to just to do some of the things that we were talking about. It's not a uniform treatment across every area. They can skip areas. They can leave, kind of habitat linkages through treated areas. So I mean, those are things that we can fine tune as we go along. And I think people are mostly missing. People are concerned about forest ecosystems, but from my standpoint, we're at risk of losing our forest
ecosystems.
Yeah. That's the bigger risk. And I think also someone also said there's the fuel breaks aren't going over every acre. They're really kind of, if you look at the entirety of our community, it's a small percentage.
Yeah.
And they're typically in those margins of the community, and they're addressing mostly broom in many cases. I mean, that's the main fuel in a lot of areas.
Well, I think one of the things that I like that it does is it gives you a kind of an overview of kind of what the resources are, what is being done. And it's not clear that they've evaluated them all and given priority to any based on different criteria.
Yeah.
But they have them. But pile burning, pile burning just there's just a lot of emissions from pile burning.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's
you're saying you got to weigh things.
I just don't think you can. I mean, it's not economically feasible to take that material and use it somewhere. So you have to reduce the fuels. Yeah.
Aren't you on our biomass group?
Yeah. Well, I think. I mean, there's a lot of material that's just coming from communities, not in fuel breaks, just from people doing defensible space.
Yes.
And PG&E line clearing and roadway improvements, and that stuff gets entrained and is going to biomass recycling facilities.
Yeah.
But they're sort of at the mercy of the technology being built there. So you can either carry it somewhere, but that's not in itself, taking it to the landfill doesn't in itself make it a good carbon move, right? You have to still manage it in some fashion. And that's what I think the biomass study is largely about, is what are the technologies that could be employed, and how do we
and also I mean, you raised the question as to the composition of it. If it's so low value, is it worth even collecting and moving?
Well, I mean, they showed where they're mulching it with heavy equipment, so they're leaving the carbon in on site. They're not burning it, and it does to some degree get incorporated in the soil and increase the carbon stores in the soil, but it does decompose nonetheless. So it still eventually releases.
It releases it, yeah.
But that's different than burning. So it's it's a little more delayed, and it does enhance carbon storage.
Maybe
But you can't.
that's a way to look at it. Yeah.
But you can't put that equipment on all of the ground, and so that's where you have hand crews doing hand piling, is because the equipment can't get in there.
And then what do they do with the hand piling stuff?
They burn it.
Yeah. And that's where you get the emissions. Yeah.
And so there's ways to burn that are lower emissions.
That's one thing.
The curtain burners, if you can haul it to a site and burn it, or how you do the burns,
Kelpie
do the piles.
Yeah.
But those are kind of quality improvements. They're not really large scale changes that are going to move the needle. It's kind of.
But why? Because they're too small.
It's not. It's small the difference. It's small scale.
Yeah. So how's it going with you?
Good. Really good. Yeah.
So
been busy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, we'll have pretty soon. We're going to have much to talk about on the biomass front. So
that's great.
But the other thing is that we should all talk a little bit about the presentation we want to make to the board on the,
Oh,
yeah, I think we have a chance to do something rather than, something kind of interesting. We should do that. They want
when the practices come to the board. Is that what you're saying?
in the June meeting. I was hoping we could get it done in May.
I think they're pretty busy in May with the work plan.
Yeah, that's what she told me today. And so we'll do it in June, so we have a little time, I guess, work it out.
Yeah, good.
And also I want to talk to you about, I don't think anyone else is on, so about the policy this is MCL, the policy that I've seen from the overlap committee. This is Terry's committee, and it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. MCL's policy.
Yeah. And
You can attend those meetings.
I know, but last time even though last time they were so rude, they can't be anymore because I'm now on the board. But fortunately, I have a thick skin. But the other thing about it is not that. Is that I think we really that you and Larry and Bill and I ought to look at it. And I think from my point of view is, especially now that it's been approved, it's going to be approved by the board, that the ESP guidelines should be part of the discussion, should be in there. You should not, it acts as if they don't exist.
Yeah.
And I think it needs to be woven in there.
That's a good point.
So so whenever you have a good idea, then you got to figure out how to do it. So that's right.
Yeah.
So I think we'd like to talk about that sometime.
Yeah,
soon.
I think that's good. Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Okay.
I'm the policy is, I think partly, Terry and I had differences, but it was more about writing a letter, the timing of it.
Yeah.
And, because it was aligned with Fern's action, and I just thought that was a really bad idea. I think the policy, it doesn't have.
I'm going to turn the recording off.
It wasn't a policy issue. We had it